Om Prarthaya Pradibhujidam Bhagavata Narayanena Swayam Vyasena Vyadidam Puranamina Madhye Mahabharatam Advedam Rudavarshinim Bhagavadim Ashtadishadhyayinim Ambattva Manasandadhami Bhagavad Gita Bhavadveshinim. O Bhagavad Gita, with which Partha was enlightened by the Lord Narayana himself, and which was incorporated in the Mahabharata by the ancient sage Vyasa, the Blessed Mother, the destroyer of rebirth, showering down the nectar of Advaita, and consisting of 18 chapters. Upon thee, O Bhagavad Gita, O loving Mother, I meditate. Now we were dealing with the 71st verse, 71. Vihaya kaman yisruvan umam saradi nispraha nirmamo nirahankara sashanti matagicchati. It's a famous verse. Now, in the earlier part of this chapter, we read in answer to Arjuna's question, Sthitaprajnasya ka bhasha samadhistasya keshava sthidati kim prabhasheda kim asida brajeda kim. This is the question which Arjuna put to Krishna in the 54th verse. How does a spiritually enlightened person behave in this world? What language does he speak? In the sense, how does he interact with others? What are the external signs by which we can judge whether he or she is a spiritually evolved person? In answer to this question, Krishna said, Prajahadi yada kaman sarvan parthamanogadan atmani eva atmana tushtaha sthitaprajna stadojide. It's a most famous verse. One important sign of a spiritually elevated person is he will be contented within himself. In the sense, he feels that he is that infinite, immortal, immanent reality, all-pervading Atman. He is that reality. And he is every moment enjoying the experience of absolute unity with that all-pervading reality. This is what he said. It shows that a spiritually elevated person will be a person of deep conviction, deep faith, that is not just this psychophysical mechanism, he is something far beyond. He is something immortal. He is the everlasting absolute reality. So he will be, or she will be a person of deep conviction. And at the same time, in the 70th verse, we have already dealt with another important aspect of this spiritually elevated person. There's apuryamana achala pradishtham samudra mapa pravishandiyat tadut kamayam pravishandi sarve sa shanti mapnoti nakamakami. In the 51st to 55th verse, Krishna said, Atmani eva atmana tushtaha. Within him, he enjoys his identity with the immortal Atman. So he is never dissatisfied, he is never depressed, he is ever serene, ever calm, ever kind, in that beatitude, in that blissful experience of his non-difference, the experience of non-difference with the immortal or pervading reality, immanent reality. This shows, as I said, that he should be a person of deep conviction that is beyond the psychophysical mechanism. If this is the conviction he has got, he will be broad-minded also. So the depth of conviction, the depth of conviction and the broad vision, the broad-minded outlook, the compassionate approach towards other people, of course, not with attachment, but without any attachment. So one should be compassionate, one should be broad-minded, one should be sympathetic without attachment. Because if you are sympathetic towards one person, and if you are also attached, that sympathy can take the form of its opposite emotion to some other people. So an intense attachment to one person is always another form of some kind of aversion to some other people. It's called raga and dvesha, aversion and attachment. They go together. You can never be attached to anyone without being, I won't use the word hostility, but without having some aversion towards something else. But a spiritually elevated person is compassionate, broad-minded, without attachment. The illustration is very apt. The mighty ocean, peaceful and calm, and innumerable rivers, mighty rivers, empty their waters in the ocean. The ocean doesn't go in search of water. The ocean doesn't go in search of the rivers. But the ocean is not hostile. The ocean doesn't reject the waters which come and merge with the ocean. It doesn't welcome, but it doesn't avoid. So this kind of broad outlook, so deep conviction and broad-minded compassion. These are the two external characteristics of a spiritually elevated person. If you have got only conviction, deep conviction, intensity of conviction sometimes can make you a fanatic. That's why. If you have got only intensity of conviction, depth of conviction, deep conviction that your own path is right, that can perhaps become another conviction, your own path alone is right. Then the intensity of the conviction becomes fanaticism. That is not the sign of a spiritually elevated person. If anybody tells us that truth exists here only, truth doesn't exist anywhere else, that is one important sign that the person is not telling the truth. So, the intensity of conviction, the depth of conviction should be matched by an equally broad-minded, compassionate outlook to other people. So, these two verses should be put together. The 55th verse and the 70th verse. In the 55th verse you find Atmani eva atmana tushtaha, you find here. Prajahadi yadakaman sarvan parthamanogadan atmani eva atmana tushtaha Sthitaprajna stadujjati. So 55th verse. He should have a strong conviction, an inherent conviction, deep conviction that he is the Atman. And that conviction will give him an intense faith, depth and intensity and profundity. But along with that, he should also be broad-minded and compassionate towards others. As I mentioned earlier, in the Rigveda Samhita Nasadaya Sutta, there is one word, Nasadasi, Nosadasi. It's a very profound hymn, essentially Advaitic, non-dualistic in character. At one point, the Rishi says, Sato Bandhum Asadi Niravindan Krudit Pradeshya Kavayo Manisha. The saints went in search of the absolute reality. Sato Bandhu means Jagatah Karanam, that Sayana's commentary means the ultimate cause of the universe, the foundational principle of creation, the fundamental reality behind everything. So the great sage went in search of the ultimate truth. And he searched everywhere, in the external world. So he could not find that absolute truth in the external world. Then he turned this enquiry inward. When he turned the enquiry inward, he found that he himself is not different from the reality, the foundational principle, the ultimate origin of the universe that he was investigating into, that he was inquiring. And the reality is himself. He found a reality, he discovered reality within himself. Now, this gives him an intense conviction that absolute reality is the immanent principle. It resides in all beings. But along with that, he also realized that the same reality is the all-pervading reality, the omnipresent reality. So the immanence and the omnipresence, these two characteristics should be equally understood. And whatever we consider ourselves to be, that we become. So, if a spiritually elevated person gets a conviction that he is the Atman, which is the immanent reality and also the all-pervading reality, he becomes that. And on the one hand, he enjoys peace of mind. See, the word is the Shanti. Shanti is the word used here again and again. Nirmamo nirahankaraha sa shantim adhigacchati. So shantim adhigacchati means he attains to peace, infinite peace. So shantim adhigacchati, that is the result of this rediscovery of our true nature. We start enjoying a most inexplicable, infinite inner joy, tranquility and peace. But it doesn't enter. He also realizes that what he is also the whole creation. The reality within him exists within him. It also exists in all beings outside. So he becomes extremely broad-minded, compassionate. He can look upon the whole creation as not different from himself. In purely ethical terms, we can say he can look upon the whole humanity as one spiritual family. That's the idea behind. Swami Vivekananda in Inspired Talks says that this experience of non-dualistic oneness is the ultimate criterion for all morality, ethics and good actions. Swamiji's words are this: the infinite oneness of the soul is the eternal sanction of all morality, all ethics and all good actions. So, non-dualistic experience becomes the ultimate criterion for a kind of universal humanistic ethics and morality. Not fear of God. We need not be afraid of God. Sri Ramakrishna's gospel, we find every moment Sri Ramakrishna reminds us, Divine Mother, Mother. Is anybody afraid of his or her mother? Then what kind of son or daughter she is or he is, and what kind of mother she could be. So, our relationship with our mother is the most intimate, the most natural relationship that we can conceive of in human life. So how can we worship God and be also afraid of Him or her? Fear of God is almost the antithesis of spirituality. If God is one who creates this world, divides mankind into believers and non-believers, conflicting groups of believers and non-believers, promising reward, heaven to the believers and threatening with hellfire the non-believers. That's a terrible, terrible proposition. So, Vedanta says this absolute reality, this divine principle is immanent, it is residing in all beings. Gita says in the 18th chapter, Ishvara Sarvabhudanam Hridesi Arjuna Tishtati Brahmayan Sarvabhudani Yantra Rudhan Nimaya. Lord Krishna says, Arjuna, God resides in all beings. See, Sarvabhudanam meaning not only human beings, even nature or animal kingdom, they are all expressions of the divine. If they are distinct and different from God, God creates all of them for us, our enjoyment, then how can we call that God a compassionate being towards other creation? So this divine principle is the all-pervading and the infinite reality. So, in that sense, a Sthitaprajna, a spiritually evolved person, becomes a man or a woman of intense conviction, serenity, peace and blissfulness. At the same time, he or she looks upon whole creation, humanity, as her or his own spiritual family. There is no distinction. That's the idea behind. And then, such an elevated person is never deluded. He never comes under any delusion. Once he realizes that, once he gets a spark of that inner experience, he becomes completely free from all doubts, conflicts and delusions and ignorance. So that's the idea behind. One important characteristic of that person is that he or she inherently practices what is good for others. Deliberately, a spiritually evolved person cannot do any harm, cannot hurt anyone in this world, because he has experienced this oneness, unity of existence. And that's a real spiritual freedom. The real spiritual freedom is this complete freedom from the tyranny of senses. And it comes along with the experience of inner serenity. Now, what is the nature of this freedom? See, in Swamiji's complete verse, in Vivekananda's complete verse, there is an interesting illustration. He gives an illustration to drive home the idea of freedom. A huge locomotive made of steel or iron is moving the rail track. It's coming at a very high speed, is a huge thing. And a small worm is crawling on the track. It could be a worm or it could be a small tiny creature. Now, in terms of physical strength, size and speed, this locomotive is millions of times bigger, stronger and faster than this tiny crawling worm. But there is one difference. The locomotive cannot decide for itself. If it wants to stop, it has to borrow intelligence from the driver who applies the brake. The locomotive cannot think for itself, cannot decide for itself. But this crawling worm, or maybe a cat, or maybe a tiny dog, he can decide. A huge thing is coming at fast speed, pace. It may crush me. So he can just crawl out of this track and save its life. But locomotive cannot do that, except when it is asked to do that by the driver who applies the brake. Now, who is higher and superior in terms of evolution? The tiny worm is certainly higher, because it has got the freedom to make a movement to save itself, which the bigger and stronger and faster machine cannot do. Similarly, the human being can, if she wants, make a quantum leap in evolution. We cannot evolve further at the physical level, but we can evolve further at the spiritual level. And the process of evolution and the process of reaching the destination of unity of the individual soul and the universal soul is technically called yoga in Vedantic tradition. So, this decision, the ability to decide for oneself, is necessary, is a most essential prerequisite for any spiritual seeker. That's why this verse is Vihaya Kaman Yasarvan. A person who gives up all desires and who becomes completely free from any kind of egotism, selfishness, and hankering, longing for material things. That person attains the Shanti, this infinite peace, the state of a spiritually elevated person. He or she gets spiritual illumination. Now, the ability to give up means to say no to sense objects. In fact, that is an important characteristic of a person of spiritual restraint. The ability to say no to material wants. Because our normal instincts are so oriented towards spirit, towards sense enjoyments, that automatically and naturally, through reflex action, the five senses of perception drag the mind towards external objects, sense objects. As I already enumerated earlier, in the light of the famous verse in the Vedic Scriptures, Nisabdadavi Panchavireva Pancha, Panchatama Pusagunena Badhaha, Virangamadanga Padangavinaha, Bhungaha, Nara Panchaviranjidaki. In the case of different animals, one sense of perception is enough to take them to the destruction. But in the case of human beings, all the five senses are actively involved in dragging the mind towards external objects. So the ability to say no is very important as a first step in spiritual life and as a first step for spiritual freedom. In fact, that is the first step in perhaps in spiritual evolution. As I said, physical evolution is no more possible, but there is still scope for spiritual evolution. And spiritual evolution begins when we learn to say no to sense objects. Because, as I said, freedom to the senses leads to spiritual slavery, and freedom from the senses leads to spiritual liberation. In the Gita itself, Lord Krishna has given a long description of how in ancient times great men and women practiced this spiritual freedom in their life. Not just hermits and sages living in caves and forests, but those who were living right in the midst of day-to-day activities. In the 4th chapter, it begins like that. If we got the first and second verse of the 4th chapter, where Lord Krishna gives a long, very elaborate graphic description of an ancient tradition. Imam vivasude yogam prottavanaham avayam vivaswan manave praha manhu iksha kavya pravit evam parambira praptam imam rajashriyo viduhu sakalena iha mahada yogo nashtat parantava. These are the first and second verses of the 4th chapter. Now here, Lord Krishna is referring to a long lineage of kings and emperors who lived in ancient times, who were busy with their kingly duties and responsibilities, administration, office work and everything. who were active right in the midst of all so-called worldly duties and responsibilities. And they were the practitioners of the highest yoga, which is referred to as an important characteristic of a spiritually elevated person in these 18 verses. And there he calls them by a technical term called Rajarshi. Rajarshi technically means a person who is combined in his or her life the dynamism, the efficiency, the workaholism, you may call it if you want, the enthusiasm, the zeal, which are characteristics of a man of this world or a woman of this world, an administrator, a king or an emperor, and the serenity, the tranquility of a sage meditating in a cave or a hermitage. Is it possible? In fact, that's the only hope for the next stage in the evolution of human civilization. Because at least in advanced countries, we have already reached the peak of material comforts and material enjoyment. So the next question is, what beyond? So here, Shankaracharya in his commentary explains these kings. He says, Evam Kshitriya Parampara Praptam Imam Rajashyo Rajanascha Te Rishayascha Rajashyeha Viduhu Imam Yogam. He says, this yoga, this technique of spiritual life, combining action and contemplation, combining the serenity, the peaceful, the tranquil, the attitude of a sage or a philosopher, and a man of action, a king. It is possible. In a small commentary on this Bhashya, Shankara's commentary, a further insight is offered in explaining as to what should be the characteristics of a yogi, such a Rajarshi, one who combines in his character the role or the characteristics of a king and also of a sage. That means sageliness within, or saintliness within, and kingliness without. Maybe Confucius used the term. Confucius and Plato. Plato, of course, philosopher king, he said a king should become a philosopher rather than a philosopher becoming a king. Because a philosopher may not be honored because he doesn't have the kingly power. So kings should try to become philosophers. That is the hope. That is, because kings who have already executive power can supervise, can make some active contribution to social life, become philosophers. They can impose this high ideal of philosopher king on society. This is Plato's concept. Now, a great commentator on Shankaracharya's commentary gives a psychological insight as to what is meant by kingliness and saintliness in this concept, in yoga. He says, Rajatvam Aishwarya Sambatti Rishitvam Tasyaha Sukshmartha Darsana Kshamatam. This is a Sanskrit expression. I shall explain. He says, what is kingliness? Kingliness corresponds to, it is symbolic of power, wealth, luxury, all this. Abundance of power, wealth, luxury, everything. And what is saintliness? The characteristic of a sage or a rishi. A rishi can see and understand that kingliness, that is physical prosperity, material prosperity, cannot be an ultimate goal in human life. It is perishable. That is, Sukshmartha Darsana Kshamatva means the ability to understand the true and subtle nature of material prosperity. The truth behind material prosperity is that it may give you comfort, but it is something perishable. It is not immortal. So whatever comfort it gives you can also be perishable. It cannot be immortal. So this can be properly realized only by a rishi. It takes a rishi to realize this. A king cannot do that. So if we can combine in our life the efficiency, the zeal, the enthusiasm of a great administrator, at the same time the ability to understand, at least within ourselves, that whatever efficiency we may have, whatever physical prosperity we may have, cannot bring ultimate peace. This wisdom is possible only from spirituality. Science cannot do that. Science can give us power, wealth, knowledge, but science cannot give us wisdom. Wisdom implies the ability to go deeper and to see and understand the true nature of something. That is the real meaning of the Sanskrit term. Sukshmartha Darsanakshanata means the efficiency, the ability to go deeper into something and not only understand its nature but also its limitation. In fact, the ability to understand the limitation is the hallmark of wisdom. You should understand something. We should also understand its limitation. We should start, we should also know where to stop. That is wisdom. That only spirituality can give. So, a spiritually elevated person who reaches that stage is called a Sthitaprajna. In social life, this ideal was practiced on the basis of 4 fundamental values of life in ancient Vedic times. They are called dharma, artha, kama and moksha. Dharma is the restraining, the guiding principle behind our activities. Artha, kama together constitute the means for enjoyment and enjoyment itself. So, practically it means civilization. Civilization implies science, technology, the ability to conquer external nature and the ability to make use of the mystery of external nature to improve comforts, to travel faster and faster, to bring the world together by explosive developments in communication, transportation and so on. All these are included in dharma, artha and kama, the 3 values which constitute the essence of what we call civilization. We have science and technology which are the means to produce results, fulfill our desires. And we have an order also. This is an order, a discipline, a method, dharma. In its higher meaning, dharma is something much greater. Dharideti dharma. Dharma is something that preserves, that keeps things intact. That is the foundation, that's the essence, that's the support, that's called dharma. But here in this context, it's a value. It means when we go in search of physical comforts, we must follow certain rules, regulations and principles of righteousness, do's and don'ts. That's dharma. Now, a 4th value is added to bring in the ideal of spirituality, that is moksha. Now, the idea is this. Moksha is that stage where you begin to realize the limitations of material prosperity. So the principle was, if we follow the principles of dharma in our pursuit of physical comforts, physical enjoyments, if we acquire them without deviating from the path of dharma or righteousness, one day we will realize the limitations of physical enjoyment, material life. And then we ask the question, what lies beyond? The fundamental question which is asked in metaphysics is the beginning of spiritual inquiry. What lies beyond? What is the mystery, the essence of human life? Material comforts cannot be the end of human existence. But this question comes naturally to us only if we follow the path of material prosperity without deviating from the path of righteousness or dharma. We call it in broad sense a combination of individual morality and national morality. If people deviate from the path of dharma, righteousness, in their pursuit of artha and kama, physical, material desires, if they deviate from the path of dharma, then they will never realize the limitation of dharma. The limitation of material prosperity. We will realize the limitation of material prosperity only if we hold fast to dharma. And if we deviate from dharma, we will not realize limitations of material prosperity. And we may even think that material prosperity is an end in itself. There is nothing beyond that. That takes us to adharma, the opposite of righteousness. That's a fundamental principle. So dharma, artha, kama and moksha, 4 values. Moksha means liberation. We can say the ultimate spiritual value. In all religious traditions, spiritual traditions, you can have this, you can find this ultimate spiritual ideal, a spiritual paradigm, the ultimate goal of human existence, beyond which there is nothing. That's the idea behind it. Now, Krishna says, if a person realizes this at the end, the flag end of his or her life, he or she will not be born again. The transmigratory cycle comes to an end, he is liberated once for all. In his commentary, Shankaracharya says, this high spiritual ideal must be reached at least by the end of our life. But we should try our attempt, we should make our attempt right from the early years. We should not wait to the end of our life. So how fortunate they are who realize this at least at the end of their life and reach liberation, and how much more fortunate they are who realize this at the beginning of their career and organize and direct their activities, their life according to this principle. That Shankaracharya's commentary says, Sthitva asyam sthidau brahmyam yathoktayam antakale api ante vayasi api brahmanirvane brahmanirvritim moksham gacchati kimu vaktavyam brahmacharyadeva sanyasya yavat jivam yo brahmani eva avadishtade sa brahmanirvanam gacchati. So how much fortunate they are who are wise enough to start a spiritual career when they are young, but they need not worry if they are old, somewhat old when they begin, because that also is a good beginning. They will get a chance, they will get an opportunity to continue the journey in the next life. That's the state. That's the state of a person who remains in a state of absolute and complete union with the universal self, the unity of individual self and the universal self. That's the idea behind. Yesha yathokta brahmani brahmi brahmani bhava yam sthiti sarvam karma sanyasya brahmarupena eva avasthanam idiyata. So in Vedanta, one important principle is what you attain, that you become. It's a special aspect of non-dualistic philosophy. As I said, I was referring to the famous verse in Rigveda. The great sage who went in search of the ultimate cause of the universe failed to discover that ultimate cause in the external world, then turned the inquiry towards himself, gave internal orientation to that investigation, and then he discovered that reality within himself, and he discovered that reality is non-different from himself. So when you reach the supreme truth, you realize you are non-different from the supreme truth. So a person who realizes the reality of the all-pervading Brahman, the immanent reality, the Atman, he realizes that he is non-different, non-distinct from that truth. And he remains in a state of perpetual experience of this unity of the individual and the universal selves at the end. But to reach this state, we must start quite early in life. Because it is said that when we come to the flag end of our life, our mind and senses are not under our control. So whatever we have thought, whatever we have speculated, whatever we have done will come to the surface. So the final impressions of a dying person will be the sum totality of all that a person has done, thought or spoken or whatever he or she has acted. All these will come in the form of a sum total at the end of the life. Because we want our mind to be within our control. The natural propensities and tendencies that we have accumulated with our conscious or unconscious actions, or words or deeds or thoughts will come to the surface. So the best way to create, to evolve a spiritual character is somehow to establish a link with whatever we do, with all our activities, and the highest spiritual ideal. Give a spiritual orientation to whatever we do, whatever we speak, whatever we do, whatever we think, all can be given a spiritual orientation. That means there is no line of demarcation between the secular and the spiritual. The line of demarcation between the secular and spiritual vanishes for a genuine spiritual seeker. The secular merges in the spiritual. The tendency to compartmentalize our activities into secular and spiritual is all right for a beginner. We may practice meditation, japa or prayers for a fixed few hours a day in the morning and evening, it's all right. But gradually we must be able to establish a link between what we do during our prayers and meditation and other life situations, so that all our activities get a spiritual orientation. That's the only way to accumulate spiritual tendencies within us. So everything should be given a spiritual orientation. If we could do that, the whole life becomes a spiritual practice. As he said earlier, the whole world becomes a temple, our whole life becomes a worship, every act becomes an act of offering, every word becomes a prayer, and every thought becomes a meditation. So the line of demarcation between the secular and spiritual vanishes. That's what we find in the lives of great spiritual saints and sages of all traditions and all religious and spiritual conventions. So now we can have interaction for some time and then we will conclude. You can ask questions in general, or we can focus on what we discussed this morning.
Swami, is that the last verse? How it ends? That's the last verse that you just said?
That's the 72nd verse of the second chapter. Esha Brahmi Sthiti Partha Nainam Prapi Vimukiri Sitvasya Mantakale Hati Brahma Nirvanam Vichya. The meaning is a person who reaches this experience, gets this experience, always be established in the awareness that he is Brahman, that person is not reborn. He's transmigrate disciple, comes to an end. He attains Brahma Nirvana. Brahma Nirvana. Nirvana is the ultimate spiritual destination. And the idea of Nirvana can be found in all traditions. It's slight variations and differences.
Thank you.
And it is for individual salvation only. This Shastra gives methods or gives dimension for individual salvation only.
No, nation.
This Shastra.
It can be applied for individuals, societies, nations. In fact, some of the idea, for example, our pursuit of material comfort is guided by the principle of dharma. It should become the hallmark of modern civilization. It gives you an idea of restraint
For all.
in our pursuit of material comforts. Yes.
The moksha is for individual.
Moksha, yes, moksha. Spiritual liberation in that sense, technically moksha is the individual. But the ideal of an ultimate spiritual goal, it goes beyond the material. That is for
Beyond individual.
that is for humanity as a whole.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Swami. Towards the end of your talk, you touched on the idea that of the importance of pursuing a spiritual life, spiritual purity early in life, because what happens at the end of life is that the sum total of your thoughts, actions come in that process. And so, does that get at the idea that moksha would probably be available to somebody that got that early start and had that purity, spiritual purity, and for those that, shall we say, didn't, basically what your goal might be more realistic to be is to set up as good an opportunity for your next incarnation as possible? And was that question, did you understand what I said?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean that moksha or liberation is possible only for those who start early in their life. There have been cases of great saints and sages who had a sudden turn in their spiritual life, not long before they died. But the transformation was so complete that they overnight became saints. So, see, look at one of Sri Ramakrishna's great disciples, household disciples. He was Giri Chandra Ghosh. He was a great dramatist and poet, and something of a prophet who led a very free bohemian life.
Right.
Now, he came in contact with Sri Ramakrishna, but he had some virtues. He believed what he said. So, you remember, he was a great poet, writer, some kind of a freelance bohemian intellectual of the city's elite circles. So he came to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna once asked him, see, you have to practice japa some specified time, morning and evening, as we do normally. He said, most of the time he'll be intoxicated, so he can't be sure when he will get up in the morning and evening. So, but he was sincere. He knew that he won't be able to practice. So he was sincere, honest enough to say, no, he can't do that. Then Sri Ramakrishna said, at least once in life, when you get it, you can't do that. And then Sri Ramakrishna finally told him, you hand over the power of atonement, the responsibility for your spiritual life. He didn't know what exactly it meant. He thought something very easy. If somebody asks you, I shall do everything on your behalf, you'll be very happy, thinking that you have nothing to do. He said, all right, he agreed. But from that moment onwards, it became physically and mentally impossible for Giri Chandra Ghosh to do anything evil, to do anything sinful. If he ever tried to drink, he will see the face of Sri Ramakrishna, his great guru, and he will throw away and he can't drink. It became impossible for him to do anything evil. Now, he was above his middle age, perhaps, when he came to Sri Ramakrishna. He was quite advanced in years. You find many such cases. There was a great sage, his name was Belur Math, and there are many such cases. He was given to lose life. So one day it seemed that his wife herself told him, you are bothering so much about me, why don't you think about God? And that was a sudden transformation in his life. He became a great saint. But these great spiritual persons, saints, they must have practiced some kind of spirituality in the early part of their life or in the previous life. I can give the example from one of our classic devotional classics. It comes in the Bhagavata Purana. The story of Ajamila is the story of a spiritual seeker who had a terrible deviation from spiritual path. During his early days, he was brought up as a pious young man. He was a devotee, but later on, he had a fall. He had a complete deviation from spiritual life. Practically, he was lost. And then what happened? Towards the end of his life, he was in a miserable condition. He suddenly called the name of his son. His son's name was Narayana. Now, Narayana is the synonym of Vishnu. Vishnu is Vyapnoti Vishnu. Vyapanat Vishnu. Vishnu literally means the all-pervading reality, the supreme temple. It's a Vishnu, one of the deities. So, he must have been a devotee, so that's why he gave the name of Vishnu to Narayana, to his eldest son. But later he had a terrible fall. He started leading a loose life. Then he was about to die. And then, it's a mythological story. The demons came, the demons who were the lieutenants, servants of Lord of Death. The Lord of Death sent his servants, terrible looking beings, to drag this fellow to hell. He was terrified. So he called out loudly, Narayana. Actually, he was not calling Vishnu, he was calling his eldest son. But that name happened to be the synonym of Vishnu. So here, when he uttered once this name, Vishnu's servants came and drove away the servants of Yama, the demons. And there is a long dialogue between them. It's a mythological story. The dialogue between the servants of Lord of Death, who are eager to take him to hell, and the servants of Vishnu, who are going to take him to heaven, to Vishnu's divine abode. So, the servants of Vishnu expounds the divine attributes of taking the name of the Lord even once. And he was taken to the divine abode of Vishnu. That's a story. But there is another aspect to this story in some Puranas. Now, what happened? This man who had practiced some spirituality, worship or meditation or listening to spiritual discourses, maybe in the early part of his life, had already accumulated some spiritual tendencies, impressions in his mind. It was there. Then he had a fall. He started leading a loose life. Now, when the servants of the Lord of Death came, he was terrified. So whom will we call? He called his son for protection. The son's name was Narayana. He was not really calling Vishnu, he was calling his son. But when he uttered a name, the past impressions, he was uttering the same name as a devotee during the early part of his life. Narayana is the divine name of Lord Vishnu. So those impressions that he had gathered as a small boy, when he was uttering this divine name with great devotion, came to the surface. So that became an instrument for his liberation. So we should not get away with the impression that you start early in life or you are lost. No. Shankaracharya is making a remark to encourage, to inspire us to start quite early in life so that we won't procrastinate. That's the idea. It comes in the commentary. So that's the idea behind. So that's why, see, look at the story of this Ajamila, this great devotee, who was a devotee, then had a terrible fall in his life, a deviation, and then unconsciously he uttered the name of his son, who happened to be Narayana's name, Vishnu's name. It could be anything. In any religious tradition, it could be anything. Anything that brings to your mind some divine spiritual associations. That's what is implied here.
Santa Tulasidas also.
Tulasidas. Another is a great poet, yes. There are many such great saints and sages. So, there are many such illustrations. Now we will conclude. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Sri Ramakrishna Order. Om peace, peace.